Welcome back, listeners, to the InFAWmation Nation, brought to you by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Division of Fish and Wildlife, Hunter Education Program. I'm your host, Scott Travers, and with me today I have my production assistant, Branton Elliman. We are coming to you from the Outdoor Education Office, located within the Arcadia Management area in Exeter, Rhode Island. As always, the focus is on hunting and hunter education, fishing and aquatic education, and all things wildlife outreach related in the state of Rhode Island. This episode, we're going to be talking with Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife's outreach assistant for the volunteer and wildlife outreach programs, Gabby DeMeillon. So welcome, Gabby. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on the show. So I am from Rhode Island. I have been here my whole life. The rest of my family is all from New Jersey, so I'm the only true Rhode Islander, and I am proud of that. As far as my background, I went to the University of Rhode Island, and there I studied wildlife conservation biology. So while I was there, I actually got to do a fellowship with URI, and I got to go down to Long Island and Fire Island, and I studied reptiles and amphibians there. We did a whole project where we just walked around and looked for snakes and toads and turtles and frogs. So it was a great time. So I did that, and then from there, I actually was a seasonal here for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. I worked helping out the waterfowl biologists, so trapping ducks, looking for wood ducks and checking their boxes. So that was a really good time, and had a ton of other random experiences with conservation and education in Rhode Island. I went over to Indiana, and I studied Massasauga rattlesnakes there, so that was fun too. We didn't find any, but
No kidding.
Yeah, we're only looking in places where they hadn't been found in over 30 years, so we didn't actually find any rattlesnakes, but we found a lot of other cool things and a lot of other cool snakes. So that was fun. So a lot of different experiences that brought me here today.
Wow, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do as the outreach technical assistant?
So basically, I just talk to people all the time. It's basically my job. So I help Mary Gannon, who's the Wildlife Outreach Coordinator, and we run programs all throughout the year. We do school programs, we do public programming, field programs, basically anything to talk to the public about our projects that we have going on here at Fish and Wildlife, and just generally about wildlife in Rhode Island. And then for the volunteer side of things, I help our volunteer coordinator, who is Jennifer Brooks. And for that, we take people out into the field, and they actually help us with research. So they'll help us either ban ducks, ban geese, count bats, monitor wildlife in any way possible, help maintain habitat. So that's really broad, and we do a lot of really fun stuff with that as well.
Wow, cool. We'll talk more about those outreach opportunities in a little bit. One of the things that you always make sure to mention in the programs is the Wildlife and Sportfish Restoration Program. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the heads up on that. So I always like to mention the Wildlife and Sportfish Restoration Program. First of all, because it's just a really cool program, and secondly, because they also help fund basically all of the conservation work in Rhode Island. So what it is hunters and anglers, when they buy their firearms, archery equipment, or anything related to hunting and fishing, a little piece of that money goes to the federal government, and then it's dispersed throughout all of the states, and each state has to use that money to support conservation. So things like habitat acquisition, land acquisition, habitat monitoring, wildlife research, hunter education, wildlife outreach, anything like that. It's actually all funded mostly by hunters and anglers. So it's a really great program because they're the ones who use those resources, and so they pay into it, and then they actually help to conserve more land, which in turn helps them by providing more game for them and providing more habitat for the species. So it's a really great program, so I always make sure to try to mention that.
Yeah, that's a great example of where your tax dollars actually go back into something that you see the benefit of.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So yeah, that's really cool. So can you give us a quick peek into that volunteer program? And I know Jen Brooks is going to be coming on, in a few more episodes, so we don't want to steal her thunder. But if you can just give us, again, like a quick peek into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Some of the opportunities that we have coming up, so currently we have herring count surveys. So that's when volunteers come out to some of the fish ladders across the state, and they can do this completely on their own time whenever they feel like it, between April 1st and the end of May. And they'll basically stare at the water for 10 minutes and just watch herring as they move upstream, because they're actually migrating from the ocean to those freshwater systems to try to spawn or reproduce. So the volunteers help by counting those fish so we can see how many fish are coming up, how the population is doing, and then we can kind of run the numbers and see if they need any more help or if there's anything that we can do to improve their habitat or their population. So we have the fish ladders in place because those herring populations in the past had declined, because they wouldn't be able to get up past the dams and things like that. And so now we have that passage that's available to them so they can make their way up, and the populations have rebounded. So they're doing much better now, but you're still not allowed to fish for herring.
Gotcha. So those fish ladders are actually very, very important to the fish population.
Absolutely. Yeah, the herring probably wouldn't be able to get up the rivers without those there. So they provide that passage so they can still reproduce, have more young so that population can grow.
Gotcha. And can you give us maybe a couple of examples of locations where these fish ladders are located throughout the state, just so our listeners might have a chance to go and actually see them?
Sure. So there's one right on Main Street in Wakefield. So you can take a look at that one. It's right by the Paul Massey dealership. There's one up in East Providence by Rising Sun Mills, and then there's another one at Hunt's Mill at the Hunt House Museum. And there's a bunch more all throughout the state. Those are just a few, but those are some of the ones that we actually perform the counts at.
Well, it's fantastic. Yeah. So that gives our listeners, again, an opportunity to go out there and actually see some of these things. Mm-hmm. So that's great.
Yeah. We have also coming up bat roost counts, and those are really fun. So we have volunteers come out with DEM staff, and we'll actually count bats as they leave their maternity roost, which is the place where all the female bats gather together to have their young. So we basically sit out in lawn chairs right around dusk, and we watch the bats as they fly out overhead, and you can see their silhouettes as they leave. So we count them once in the beginning of the summer before they have their pups, and then once at the end of the summer after they've had their pups, so we can see how many new young were born. And that's a really fun and really relaxing way to spend a summer evening.
Wow, that's cool. You do that in the summertime, right?
Yeah, that's a summer one.
Well, that's neat. Up. Oh, really, really cool. So what events are actually coming up and coming with the Wildlife Outreach Program right now?
So the next program we have coming up is called Young Wildlife, and that's going to be a Zoom program in partnership with the Clark Memorial Library. And then we have a couple more coming up in June. We have a virtual snake safari.
Ooh.
So Mary and I are going to be going out and looking for snakes, trying to catch some and talk all about snakes and the conservation work with reptiles in the state. We have a wildlife Q&A with the Green Library a little bit later on in June. And for that one, we're basically just going to take questions from anybody that has a question about wildlife in the state and try to answer them. And then we have a couple more in the summer. One of them is on birds, and then the other one is part of our Wildlife Solution series, and it's called Vegetable Vandals.
Ooh, wow. Boy, I know a lot of people would be interested in that one. That's fantastic. So a lot of what you do also kind of helps to minimize problems or conflicts between people in the state and the wildlife that also resides here.
Yeah, so that's we just started a new series called the Wildlife Solution series, and that is all about human-wildlife conflicts and coexisting with wildlife.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask a question, and I know I've heard this 1,000 times, and I'm sure pretty much everybody at DEM has in one way or another. Are there any poisonous snakes in Rhode Island?
There are not any venomous snakes in Rhode Island. So there's a little bit of a difference between poisonous and venomous. So poisonous is if you eat it, you die. Venomous is if it bites you, you die. Well, maybe not necessarily die, but it'll make you very sick. So we don't have any medically significant venomous snakes. So there are some that have a tiny bit of venom, but nothing that would ever affect humans. It's just would affect something like a mouse. So we don't have any venomous snakes. We used to have timber rattlesnakes a long time ago, back in the 70s, but we haven't seen any since then. So we're pretty sure that they're completely gone. We just don't have habitat for them anymore, and there's not really a way for them to get back over here again.
Gotcha. Understood. Okay. All right. Well, cool. So what is your favorite program out of all the programming that you do that you like to teach?
So it's a hard one because we have a lot of really fun programs. But because I love reptiles and amphibians, I always love talking about anything related to them. We just had a vernal pool night recently where Mary and I went to a vernal pool, which is just a seasonal wetland. And we went and looked for frogs and salamanders and looked for their egg masses. And that was so much fun. But basically anything reptile and amphibian related, I love to talk about. So I'm really looking forward to that snake search. And I hope we find some snakes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So what would somebody do if, say, they discovered a vernal pool, or if they purchased property and there was a vernal pool on the property, or maybe even just a small body of water they believe to be a vernal pool? What should they do? Should they investigate the pool? Should they stay away from it, or maybe call the office?
Yeah, I mean, they could definitely, if they want to take a look in it, that's completely fine. But if you do ever go into a wetland, you want to make sure that if you go into that wetland, first of all, that you're careful walking around, because things like frogs might be hiding underneath the leaf litter, or their egg masses might be there in the springtime, so you wouldn't want to break those up. So just look where you're walking and kind of walk carefully and slowly if you do walk into one. And after you're done going into that pool, you want to make sure you sanitize anything that touched the water, so boots or nets or buckets. And that's because water has diseases in it like chytridiomycosis and ranavirus that can spread to other amphibians if you carry it on your equipment to a new wetland. So you always want to make sure you wash all of your waders and any of that equipment that you have.
Right, gotcha. And as a fly angler, I know that we always try to do that when we go from one water system to another. So can you tell us what would that cleaning solution be that you might recommend?
So just a 3% bleach solution. So what you do is you get out of the wetland. You want to make sure you rinse your things a little bit away from the wetland so the bleach doesn't get in there. You just scrub it with soapy water, rinse it off, spray it with that 3% bleach solution, rinse it off, and let it dry in the sun. And that's it.
Gotcha. Perfect. So can you tell us a little bit more about that Wildlife Solution series that you recently started? And what's the biggest conflict between humans and wildlife that you're aware of and that you hear about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Wildlife Solution series kind of came about because we get calls all the time in the office about animals and what to do if you see them. Why are there coyotes in my yard? Why am I seeing more wildlife this time of year? And so it was hard to try to communicate what we wanted people to know or what we wanted people to do with just a short 5-minute phone call. So we developed these series of programs which correspond with the seasons and what we were getting the most calls about. So for example, our first program was in the wintertime, and that was called Nocturnal Nuisances. And it was about coyotes, foxes, and fishers, and why we're seeing them more, who's making all those screaming calls, which is not fishers, it's actually foxes, believe it or not, and what you can do to try to prevent conflict and coexist with these animals. And so one of the biggest conflicts that we found between humans and wildlife is just that we're accidentally feeding them. So we might not realize it, but things like cat food or compost piles or unsecure garbage cans, these are all food sources for wildlife, and we're drawing them into our yards and providing food for them, providing shelter underneath our decks or raised structures where they could find their dens. So all of these things combined kind of drew wildlife into our yards. So we want to communicate to people, you don't have to be afraid if you see a coyote. You don't have to be nervous. It might just be part of their life history that you're seeing them more often, like wintertime is coyote breeding season, so you're going to see them more often. But some of the things that we can do is take away these human-supplied food resources to make sure that they're not being drawn to our yards for the wrong reasons. Right,
gotcha. So what's the division doing to better understand all of these interactions?
So we have a lot of research projects going on. One of them is the Narragansett Bay Coyote Study partnership that we have. So for that project, Numi Mitchell, who's the lead on it, she's going out trapping coyotes, and then she'll put a GPS collar on them. And then she'll watch where the coyotes move to and where they spend a lot of time or return back to frequently. And then she'll go visit those places. And at those places, what she found was things like pet food left outside, open garbage cans or compost piles. And so all of those things that I was telling you before, they're based on research. So we actually know that the coyotes were returning to those places more frequently because there was food that was supplied by humans there. And so that's why I say, remove those things, because they're actually attracting more animals. So not just coyotes, but lots of other animals will eat those things, like foxes, skunks will come, opossums. Pretty much everything loves cat food. So that's one of the biggest things we say is bring your cat food inside, because anything will eat cat food. It's like this nice, tasty treat for them.
Okay. So a lot of these things are actually, or a lot of these interactions are caused because of human activity and things that we might not necessarily be thinking or considering and understanding the consequences of.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people we have found are intentionally feeding wildlife, and that is illegal. So you're not actually allowed to feed wildlife in Rhode Island, with the exception of a raised bird feeder. And that's because we don't want to habituate animals to humans. We don't want them to get used to being around people, because they are wild animals. We're not sure how they're going to react to us. And so we don't want a coyote to be coming up, to a girl waiting at a bus stop because someone else was hand feeding them. And the other part of that is that feeding wildlife can spread disease. So imagine if you had a spoon and you were feeding everyone in the room off of the same spoon, you're going to be spreading disease around. And the same thing can happen for wildlife. If you feed wildlife out of the same place and all these animals are coming to the same bowl, that's going to spread disease, like chronic wasting disease, which we know is really bad in surrounding states. But we don't have it here yet in Rhode Island, but we don't want it here. And we definitely don't want to spread it by feeding wildlife.
Gotcha, understood. So can you tell us a little bit about carrying capacity, what that means, and how that impacts conservation?
Yeah, definitely. So there's two different kinds. There's biological carrying capacity and cultural carrying capacity. So biological carrying capacity is just how much or how many animals the habitat can support. And so that's based on the amount of resources that are available: food, water, shelter, and space. And then there's cultural carrying capacity, which is how many animals we as humans can tolerate. And so those are going to be different. Usually the cultural carrying capacity is much lower than the biological carrying capacity. But because humans are supplying animals with more food unintentionally through the cat food and the garbage cans and all that, we have actually raised the biological carrying capacity. So now the habitat, which normally would only be able to support, say like 100 coyotes, can now support 150 because we're supplying that extra food. But our cultural carrying capacity is saying we can only tolerate 80 coyotes. So we have 150 coyotes and we can only tolerate 80. So that's where the conflict arises.
Gotcha, understood. So are there any laws on trapping wildlife on private property in Rhode Island?
Yes, there are. So I won't go too far into it because I'm not an expert on the laws, but what I can tell you is you can trap wildlife on private property, but if you trap wildlife, you have to be able to dispatch it legally within your state. And so there are laws between towns, whether you can discharge a firearm a certain distance from a house, whether you can even discharge a firearm in your town. So you have to make sure that there's a legal and humane way to dispatch that animal that you have trapped. So that's something to keep in mind. If you have an animal that's a problem, it might not be the best idea to trap it. You might want to just remove those resources. And removing those resources is really the only way that you're going to solve the problem, because if you just trap an animal and you don't remove those resources, another animal is just going to move in right away.
Right, yeah. So the actual real solution to the problem is to remove those resources, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, not just food resources, but shelter. So things like raised sheds that are up on those cinder blocks and open areas underneath porches. Pretty much any animal is going to see that as a nice spot to hunker down. So things like coyotes, foxes, skunks, bears even. So we're just getting bears into this state. And there have been reports of bears denning underneath decks, not in Rhode Island, but in other places. So that's something to be aware of as our population of black bears increases.
Right, understood. So I know sometimes when people trap animals, they do it with these cage traps or have a heart trap so that they don't harm the animal. Some people may try to take the animal once they trap it on their property and bring it somewhere else. So is there anything that you can tell us about relocating wildlife? And is that legal to do? And is it ethical to do?
So it is not legal to relocate animals in Rhode Island. You can only move it within the same property. So you can move it farther away from your house on your same property, but you can't actually take an animal and move it somewhere else. And the reason why we don't want to do that is it might seem like a humane option at first. You think, I don't want to kill the animal. I want it to live. But it's basically a death sentence if you just relocate an animal, because you're putting it somewhere where it doesn't know where to find food, where it doesn't know where to find shelter. So it's going to be very stressed, and it might not be able to find those resources. It can also spread disease. So if an animal is sick, then you could be spreading disease to a new location. And then the other thing is that if you have a problem animal and you move it somewhere else, you're just moving the problem somewhere else. You're not solving it. And someone else is going to be upset that you moved your problem animal onto their property. So there's lots of reasons why you shouldn't. And most of the time, if you relocate an animal and you move it somewhere else, it's going to try to get back to wherever it came from. And that is most likely in Rhode Island going to involve crossing roads. And so a lot of animals get hit trying to get back to the place where it came from.
Right. So for a lot of different reasons, that's the wrong thing to do.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. So changing gear a little bit, of course, we all know it's the springtime. It's baby season for wildlife in Rhode Island. What should we do if we come across orphaned wildlife?
Yeah, it's a great question. We get so many calls into the office about injured or orphaned wildlife or baby wildlife. A big one is fawns. So one of the things people call about all the time is, oh, there's this cute tiny little baby fawn and it's all by itself. I'm so worried about it and I don't know what to do. Well, fawns, deer, they naturally will leave their fawns by themselves, and the adults, the mom will go off and forage somewhere else, and she'll come back to check on that fawn. So if you see a fawn by itself, it's not necessarily a need for concern. If the fawn is in a dangerous situation, like it's on a road or in a parking lot, then you would probably want to call somebody. And so the person to call about any injured or orphaned wildlife is the wildlife clinic. And that number is 401-294-6363. And they will answer any questions that you have. If you're unsure, then just call them. And they have tons of great answers to any wildlife questions. If you find a baby bird, that's a great person to call. Baby bunnies, that's a great person to call. So lots of animals are having their babies this time of year. It's not necessarily a need for concern if you see a baby animal, but if you are concerned, you can always call that number.
Right. Excellent. That's a great resource. So let me just follow up by asking, if you should come across an injured animal, can anyone rehabilitate an injured or orphaned animal, or should they leave that to the professionals?
Definitely leave that to the professionals. So I gave you that number for the wildlife clinic. The people that are there are actually permitted by the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So they're trained and permitted wildlife rehabilitators. So only they can actually care for injured or orphaned wildlife. And that's because they know how to do it in a safe way and a way that's going to make sure that animal is healthy and remains wild. Because a lot of times people will, they might find a baby squirrel and they might think, oh, I can take care of this baby squirrel. They'll feed it. They might not know what to feed it, so it might be malnourished. Or they might try to kind of coddle it, and then it'll get really used to humans and then can never be released because it's too used to humans and is not safe to be released.
Gotcha. Understood. Okay. So how can our listeners reach out to you if they have any questions or have any incidents or anything that they run into and they need some information?
You can email me at gabrielle.demellon@dem.ri.gov. So that's GABRIELLE.DeMeillon, DEMEILLON @dem.ri.gov. You can also check out our wildlife outreach page. And that's a really great resource for all of our upcoming programs. So that's just dem.ri.gov/wildlife outreach.
Gotcha. And are you on any social media platforms?
Scott, you know we are. So we have Facebook and an Instagram. Our Instagram is ri.fishandwildlife. And you can just search on Facebook, RI Fish Wildlife.
Fantastic. That's great. So I almost forgot. Gabby, can you tell us some funny story of something that's happened to you while you've been in the field?
Sure, I can. So it's a little embarrassing and funny. So this was when I was a seasonal for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So just to give a heads up, I was still learning at this time. I might have not been the brightest bulb at the moment. I was under stress, but so I used to go out and check wood duck boxes. So wood duck boxes are just these boxes made out of wood, and there's a little hole in the front where the wood duck can go in and nest, and every year we check them and refill the wood shavings inside, and the side door opens up. So me and my coworker, we got to this location where there's a wood duck box, and it was in really shallow water, just a really small pool. So we were like, okay, we'll just walk in. We'll just put waders on and walk in. So we walk in. We brought paddles because we wanted to make sure, we wouldn't fall over. So we had some kind of support. So we're walking with our paddles over. And sometimes in the summertime, there are wasps inside these boxes. And we knew that. So we kind of tapped on the side of it with the paddle, and all these wasps started to fly out. So we had wasp spray in hand, just in case. So like, okay, we'll just spray the box. So we spray the inside of the box with the wasp spray, and more wasps come out. And one just happens to land on my coworker's head. And he started to panic and kind of freak out. And I was calm. I'm used to wasps. I don't care if they crawl all over me, but I was like, there's a wasp on your head. So he's like, oh my gosh, get it off, get it off. Kill it, get it off, get it off. So I'm panicking because he's panicking, and I have the paddle in my hand, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll just smack. And I smacked him on the head with the paddle very hard. And I killed the wasp.
But not the coworker.
But he definitely had a little bit of a lump on his head. But I was just protecting him, I think I ended up hurting him more than the wasp, though.
Oh, that's funny. That's a great story. Oh, my goodness. Well, Gabby, is there anything else that you wanted to mention? Getting towards the tail end of our episode here. I know we've covered a lot of ground.
I don't think so. I think that's just about it.
Gotcha. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for being here this episode, and I'm sure our listeners will be very happy to have heard all of your information.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, you're very welcome. So, I just want to mention again to all of our listeners that we do come out every month with a new episode, and next month we're going to be interviewing Susan Estabrook, who's a member of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association. She's also on their fly fishing, kayaking, and new app committees. She's also a member of the Rhodey Fly Rodders and a board member of the Rhode Island Trout Unlimited chapter. We will be talking about all those great organizations, the new saltwater fishing app that she's been working on, and several other organizations, and all things saltwater fly fishing related in Rhode Island. We'll also have some more questions from our listeners, and if you have any questions for any of our guests or any of our staff, you can always email me at scott.travers@dem.ri.gov. And again, that's scott.travers@dem.ri.gov. On behalf of the Division of Fish and Wildlife, the Hunter Education Program, and of course the Department of Environmental Management, this has been Scott Travers, thanking you all for listening to our episode and advising everybody to take the opportunity to head outside and enjoy some of the beautiful weather that we're having in Rhode Island this season.